November 1942. Algerian surf crashed against landing craft as American soldiers splashed onto foreign sand, rifles held high above the Mediterranean spray. But among the standard-issue M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns, wooden crates stamped with bold red letters, "Secret," contained something the enemy had never encountered. Inside those crates lay 5,000 steel tubes, each costing less than a bicycle, that would force the Wehrmacht's greatest generals to admit their doctrine of armored supremacy was finished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on the officers watching their men haul those mysterious crates onto the beach. Germany had spent a decade perfecting the panzer divisions that had crushed Poland in weeks and brought France to its knees in 40 days. Meanwhile, America was betting the war on the weapons so simple it looked like plumbing equipment. What nobody on that beach realized, not the anxious privates, not the skeptical captains, not even General Dwight Eisenhower himself, was that this crude steel tube would become the great equalizer of World War II. Within months, German tank commanders who once rolled through Europe with impunity would refuse to advance without infantry protection. The weapon that accomplished this revolution in warfare had been assembled from scrap metal just 6 months earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Spring 1942. While Hollywood churned out patriotic films and Detroit factories retooled for war production, American military planners faced a terrifying reality hidden from the public. American infantry had no effective answer to German armor. The numbers were stark and frightening. A Panzer IV tank rolling toward a standard U.S. infantry company was essentially invincible. The standard-issue M1 Garand rifle? Useless. The .30 caliber machine gun, its bullets sparked harmlessly off armor plate. Even the 37mm anti-tank gun, hauled into position by trucks and requiring a 6-man crew, struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of Germany's medium tanks. Worse still, intelligence reports from North Africa painted a grim picture. British forces, despite their empire's industrial might, were being systematically pushed back by Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Every engagement told the same story. When panzers appeared, infantry either fled or died. The psychological effect was devastating. Veteran British soldiers, men who'd faced everything the Germans could throw at them, admitted they felt helpless when the distinctive rumble of tank engines echoed across the desert. In Washington's War Department, behind closed doors where politicians and generals spoke candidly, the question hung in the air like smoke. How do you stop a tank when you're just a man with a rifle? The traditional answer, use your own tanks, bring up heavy artillery, call in air support, assumed you had time, resources, and perfect coordination. Real combat was chaotic. Tanks appeared suddenly around corners, crashed through hedgerows without warning, or emerged from morning fog before anyone could radio for help. Infantry needed something they could carry themselves, something that didn't require an engineering degree to operate, something that worked the first time because there might not be a second chance. Several solutions had been tested and rejected. The British offered their PIAT, a spring-loaded spigot mortar that weighed 32 pounds, had a vicious recoil that could break a man's shoulder, and was so mechanically complex that it jammed in the presence of sand, mud, or bad luck. The Soviets had developed anti-tank rifles that required 2 men to carry and delivered such brutal recoil that firing teams developed permanent hearing damage and spinal injuries. None of these would work for American doctrine, which emphasized mobility and rapid deployment. Time was running out. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, was scheduled for November. American boys, most of whom had never seen combat, would soon face the same panzers that had terrorized Europe. They needed a weapon that could kill tanks. And they needed it within months, not years. May 6, 1942. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning sun burned off the dew as America's top military brass gathered in wooden bleachers to witness demonstrations of anti-tank weapons. They'd come hoping one might solve the infantry's tank problem before American blood started soaking into North African sand. The official schedule listed impressive-sounding weapons, British-designed spigot mortars on heavy tripods, experimental recoilless rifles requiring three-man crews. Each represented months or years of careful engineering backed by teams of experts and detailed specifications. Nobody was paying attention to the slender steel tube propped in the corner of the range. That tube belonged to Lieutenant Raymond Callahan, a young officer from the Army's Experimental Weapons Division. Callahan wasn't on the official schedule. He'd essentially crashed the demonstration, convincing the range officer to give him 5 minutes at the end of the day. The weapon he carried had been assembled that very morning, literally cobbled together from whatever materials were at hand. The tube itself? Found in a scrapyard 3 days earlier, originally intended for industrial piping. Its diameter happened to perfectly match the experimental rocket warhead the Army had been testing. The site? A piece of steel coat hanger bent with pliers into a crude crosshair. The grip? Salvaged from a broken rifle stock. The electrical trigger? Wired together by Callahan personally following a schematic sketched on notebook paper. Even Callahan's assistant, Corporal James Whitmore, thought the whole thing looked insane. "Sir," he'd said that morning, "this looks like something a kid would build in his garage." That's exactly what it is, and that's exactly why it might work. The official demonstrations went poorly. The first spigot mortar failed to fire. The second missed a stationary tank target by 15 yards. The experimental recoilless rifle produced impressive noise, but failed to penetrate the target's armor. By the time the scheduled demonstrations ended, the mood in the bleachers had shifted from hopeful to resigned. That's when Callahan stepped onto the range. He wore a welder's mask, not for dramatic effect, but because nobody, including Callahan himself, was entirely sure the weapon wouldn't explode in his face. The tube weighed only 13 pounds, light enough to shoulder like a rifle. The target was an M3 Stewart, positioned 150 yards downrange, engine running to simulate a moving vehicle. "Gentlemen," announced the range officer with barely concealed skepticism, "Lieutenant Callahan will now demonstrate an improvised rocket launcher." Callahan knelt, settling the tube against his shoulder. Through the bent coat hanger sight, he aligned the target. His finger found the trigger. He took a breath, held it, squeezed. The whoosh of the rocket motor was unlike anything the assembled officers had heard. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, not the boom of artillery, but a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. A plume of white smoke erupted from the tube's rear as the rocket streaked downrange, leaving a corkscrew trail. The bleachers erupted in surprised chatter. But Callahan wasn't finished. While officers were still processing what they'd seen, he was already reloading. Whitmore handed him a second rocket. Callahan slotted it into the tube, connected 2 wires, shouldered the weapon again. 5 seconds from first shot to second shot. The second rocket hit even closer to center mass, another perfect penetration. In the bleachers, Major General Frank Richardson, head of the Army Ordnance Department, stood up slowly. He walked down from the bleachers, across the range, straight to where Callahan was lowering the smoking tube. Richardson took the weapon, turning it over with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 30 years evaluating military hardware. It was absurdly simple. A tube, some wires, a grip. That was essentially it. "Son," Richardson said finally, "what do you call this thing?" Callahan hesitated. He hadn't actually named it. "Sir, it's just a rocket tube, an electrical rocket launcher, technically." "It looks," Richardson interrupted, a slow smile spreading across his face, "like that musical instrument that comedian plays on the radio. What's his name? Bob Burns and his bazooka. Scattered laughter from the assembled officers. The name stuck immediately. The Bazooka. It was absurd. It was perfect. Richardson made his decision on the spot. While the British spigot mortars and experimental recoilless rifles were being loaded back onto trucks for further evaluation, meaning bureaucratic limbo for months or years, Richardson turned to his aide. Order 5,000 units for immediate production. I want working models in soldiers' hands before we ship out for North Africa. His aide blinked. Sir, this is just a prototype. We haven't done durability testing. We haven't evaluated different production methods. We don't have time, Richardson cut him off. The Germans aren't going to wait for us to write a perfect technical manual. This weapon works. It's simple enough that any factory in America can build it. Get it into production now. Within a week, blueprints were being distributed to manufacturing facilities across the country. The design was so simple that even small machine shops could contribute. No rare materials required, no sophisticated machinery needed. Just steel tubes, basic electrical components, and simple wooden crates for shipping. By October 1942, barely 5 months after Callahan's demonstration, bazookas were rolling off assembly lines at 5,000 per month. The soldiers who would carry these weapons into combat knew none of this backstory. They didn't know their anti-tank weapon had been assembled from scrapyard metal or named after a joke about a musical instrument. What they would learn, in blood and fire on the beaches of Algeria, was whether that bet would pay off. November 7, 1942. The night before Operation Torch launched, General Dwight Eisenhower made a discovery that should have terrified him. Not a single American soldier had been trained to use the bazooka. This wasn't oversight, it was secrecy gone wrong. The orders from Washington had been explicit. The bazooka was classified secret. The crates would remain sealed until reaching the combat zone. The reasoning made sense on paper: keep the weapon hidden from German intelligence for as long as possible, maintain the element of surprise, prevent any leaked information from reaching enemy hands. But someone had forgotten to account for a crucial detail. If the crates stayed sealed until combat, when exactly were soldiers supposed to learn how to use the weapon inside? There were no training manuals in the crates, no instructors had been assigned. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division, and the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment, units designated to receive the first bazookas, had spent weeks preparing for the invasion. They'd rehearsed beach landings, practiced small unit tactics, zeroed their rifles, and memorized radio codes. Not one of them had ever seen a bazooka outside of rumors and whispered speculation. Captain Thomas Bradford, a company commander in the 1st Infantry Division, would later write in his diary, "We received the wooden crates marked secret on November 7th, approximately 18 hours before landing. Orders were explicit: do not open until ashore. I asked my battalion commander how my men were supposed to operate a weapon they'd never seen. He had no answer. Nobody did." The mistake compounded itself through every level of command. Unit commanders assumed someone else had handled training. The Ordnance Department assumed units would figure it out. After all, the weapon was designed to be simple. Training Command assumed the weapon was still too secret for training exercises. Everyone assumed, nobody verified. When the landing craft hit the beaches of Algeria on November 8th, American soldiers faced enemy fire while simultaneously trying to understand the basic mechanics of a completely foreign weapon. Imagine the scene: pinned down by Vichy French machine guns, taking casualties, and trying to decipher by touch and intuition how to load a rocket tube you'd never held before. Private First Class Daniel Murphy, 1st Infantry Division, described it in a letter home months later. "They handed us these tubes and told us to shoot tanks with them. No instruction, no practice, just figure it out, the Germans are coming. I watched Sergeant Hayes try to load one backwards.
Corporal Jenkins connected the wires wrong and nearly electrocuted himself. We were learning to use a tank killer while tanks were shooting at us. The chaos of those first hours was compounded by a problem nobody had anticipated at testing at Aberdeen: moisture. The M6 rockets, packed in wooden crates and shipped across the Atlantic, had absorbed seawater during the voyage. The propellant, which needed to be kept dry to function properly, had become damp and unreliable. The results were catastrophic. Soldiers pulled triggers and nothing happened, or rockets fired but tumbled out of the tube, spinning uselessly into the sand. Or, worst of all, rockets detonated immediately after leaving the tube, the explosion occurring barely 20 feet in front of the shooter. The 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment kept meticulous records. Of their first 20 bazooka shots fired in combat, only 7 functioned correctly. 13 failures. That's a 65% failure rate for a weapon soldiers were trusting their lives to. Yet some worked. And when they worked, the results were stunning. November 10, 1942. Near the port town of Auxerre, a platoon from the 1st Armored Division found itself pinned down by 2 Vichy French Renault R-35 tanks. These weren't the fearsome Panthers or Tigers that would later terrorize Europe, but they were still tanks, armored vehicles with machine guns and cannon that could tear infantry apart.
Sergeant William Foster and Private Robert Chen had one of the few functioning bazookas. They had spent the previous hour experimenting with the weapon, trying different methods of loading, checking, and rechecking the electrical connections. When the Renaults appeared, grinding forward with their turret guns sweeping for targets, Foster made a decision. "We're gonna try this thing," he told Chen. "If it doesn't work, we run like hell." They set up behind a low stone wall, Chen loading while Foster aimed. The nearest Renault was perhaps 90 yards away, close enough that they could see the commander's head poking out of the turret hatch. Foster aligned the crude sight, his hands surprisingly steady despite the fact that he'd never fired this weapon before in his life. He pulled the trigger. The rocket streaked across the gap in a white blur. It struck the Renault's side armor, not the thickest part of the tank, but a joint where 2 plates met. The shaped charge detonated with a sharp crack, punching through the steel. The Renault shuddered, smoke began pouring from the engine compartment, and seconds later the crew was bailing out, uniforms scorched and faces blackened, but alive. The second Renault, seeing its companion burning, immediately threw into reverse and retreated. The threat was eliminated. Foster and Chen stared at each other, the smoking bazooka tube still in Foster's hands, hardly believing what had just happened. They'd just killed a tank. 2 regular infantrymen. No artillery support, no air cover, no anti-tank gun requiring 6 men and a truck to move it. Just 2 soldiers, a steel tube, and 5 seconds of courage. The 1st Armored Division's official after-action report, filed 3 days later, contained a single understated line: "Weapon effective when functioning properly." That sentence captured the entire paradox of the bazooka's debut in combat. When it worked, when the rockets were dry, when the electrical connections were solid, when soldiers figured out the loading procedure, it was devastatingly effective. A single infantryman could threaten a multi-ton armored vehicle that cost thousands of dollars and required months of crew training. But the failure rate was unacceptable. For every Sergeant Foster who successfully engaged a tank, there were 3 or 4 soldiers whose bazookas misfired, jammed, or exploded prematurely. The after-action reports flooding back to Washington painted a contradictory picture. Unit commanders were simultaneously praising the weapon's potential and demanding immediate fixes for its reliability problems. The Ordnance Department went into crisis mode, analyzing every failure report, testing new rocket designs, developing better waterproofing for the ammunition. But even with its problems, even with its failures, something fundamental had changed on November 10, 1942. For the first time in the war,
Ordinary American infantrymen had engaged and destroyed enemy armor without specialized equipment or support. The psychological impact rippled through both armies. American soldiers, who'd been dreading the prospect of facing German panzers, suddenly had hope. Maybe they weren't helpless after all. Maybe this crude steel tube really could change the game. And in Berlin, German intelligence officers were beginning to receive reports from North Africa. Reports of a new American weapon. Something portable, something simple, something that killed French tanks. The reports were fragmentary and confused, but they contained enough detail to worry the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. If the Americans had developed an effective man-portable anti-tank weapon, and if they could produce it in large numbers, the entire doctrine of armored warfare would need to be reconsidered. On the beaches of Algeria, as the smoke of battle drifted across the sand, the Bazooka had fired its opening shots in a revolution that would reshape World War II. The weapon was flawed, problematic, unreliable, but it was also proof of a concept that would haunt German tank commanders for the rest of the war. Tanks were no longer invincible, and any soldier with enough courage and a steel tube could prove it.
February 1943. The Tunisian desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. But the heat wasn't what terrified the retreating American soldiers of the Second Corps. That terror came from the grinding, metallic roar of German panzer engines echoing through the mountain passes of Kasserine. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had launched a devastating counteroffensive, and green American troops, many seeing combat for the first time, were being systematically shattered. Units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Entire positions were overrun before reinforcements could arrive. It was a humiliating baptism by fire for the American army, and it would cost them far more than casualties and lost ground. As German forces swept through captured American positions, they found the usual detritus of retreat: abandoned trucks, scattered ammunition, discarded personal effects. But among the wreckage, German soldiers discovered something they'd never seen before: long steel tubes with dangling wires, strange-looking rockets with peculiar cone-shaped warheads. No markings, no manufacturer stamps, just crude, functional simplicity. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commander of a Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, remembered the moment distinctly in his post-war memoir. "My men brought me 5 of these tubes, along with perhaps 20 rockets. At first, I thought they were signal flares or perhaps some kind of demolition charge launcher, but the design suggested anti-armor capability. I immediately ordered everything sent to Berlin." By February 28, 1943, those captured bazookas arrived at Germany's weapons testing center in Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. What happened next would change German military doctrine forever. The German engineering team examined the captured weapons with typical thoroughness. Every component was measured, weighed, photographed, and tested. The official technical report, filed on March 15, 1943, makes for fascinating reading. The tone shifts from clinical analysis to barely concealed alarm. American rocket launcher represents fundamentally different approach to infantry anti-tank problem. Weight, 5.9 kilograms. Production requirements: minimal. Standard steel tubing, basic electrical components, simple wooden stock. Estimated production time per unit: 6 to 8 man-hours. Effectiveness: penetrates 80 millimeters of armor plate at 100 meters range. Assessment: any industrial facility capable of basic metalwork can produce this weapon in quantity. That last line terrified German strategic planners. It wasn't just that the Americans had developed an effective infantry anti-tank weapon. It was that the weapon was so absurdly simple that America's massive industrial capacity could produce them by the tens of thousands. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, a Wehren panzer commander, was brought in to review the findings. His assessment was blunt. If the Americans equip their infantry with these weapons in the numbers their industry is capable of producing, our armored advantage is negated. A tank that must fear every infantryman is a tank that cannot operate with the speed and audacity the Panzerwaffe doctrine requires. The strategic implications were staggering. Germany's military success had been built on combined arms tactics with panzer divisions as the decisive striking force. This doctrine, refined in Poland, perfected in France, pushed to its limits in Russia, assumed that enemy infantry were essentially helpless against tanks unless they had specialized anti-tank guns or their own armor support. The bazooka shattered that assumption. Suddenly, every hedge could hide a tank killer, every building corner, every depression in the ground. Two men with a steel tube could threaten a panzer worth 20 times their annual salary and requiring months of crew training. The German response was swift and characteristically ambitious. If the Americans could develop a simple infantry anti-tank weapon, Germany would develop a better one. The project was assigned to Dr. Heinrich Langweiler, a ballistics engineer who'd worked on rocket development at Peenemünde. Where the American bazooka fired a 60mm warhead, the German weapon would use an 88mm warhead, the same caliber as the famous Flak 88. The larger warhead would provide significantly more penetration power, capable of defeating even the thickest Soviet tank armor at combat ranges. The first prototypes appeared in late spring 1943, designated Raketenpanzerschreck 43, literally Rocket Tank Rifle 43. Soldiers quickly shortened this to Panzerschreck, meaning Tank Terror. But the improvements came at a cost. The Panzerschreck weighed nearly 20 pounds versus the bazooka's 13. The larger warhead created a massive backblast that could reveal the shooter's position and even injure the operator. Early versions required the gunner to wear a protective face shield and heavy gloves to avoid being burned by the rocket exhaust. More critically, the weapon was more complex to manufacture. Each Panzerschreck required more man-hours, more materials, and more specialized components than its American counterpart. The numbers tell the story. By war's end, Germany had produced approximately 289,000 Panzerschrecks, impressive given the circumstances. But during the same period, American factories turned out over 476,000 bazookas. The United States was producing nearly 2 anti-tank weapons for every one Germany could manufacture. German field commanders recognized the disparity immediately. A Wehrmacht after-action report from the Italian campaign, dated November 1943, noted, "New Panzerschreck weapon proves highly effective against enemy armor. However, availability remains limited. American forces appear to have rocket launchers in every infantry company, sometimes every platoon. Our forces cannot match this distribution density." The industrial race that followed was brutally simple. Germany had developed the more powerful weapon, but America had developed the weapon it could actually produce in war-winning quantities. In total warfare, the advantage went to the side that could equip every soldier, not just elite units with the best equipment. Yet the Panzerschreck's appearance on the battlefield created a grim symmetry. Soviet T-34s and American Shermans now faced German infantry armed with rocket launchers, just as German panzers faced Allied infantry with bazookas. The age of the invincible tank, brief as it had been, was definitively over. July 1943. The island of Sicily baked under the Mediterranean sun as Allied forces pushed inland from their landing beaches. The campaign would prove a testing ground not just for American combat effectiveness, but for the evolving role of the bazooka in modern warfare. The weapon had matured significantly since its chaotic debut in North Africa. The M1A1 version, now in soldiers' hands, featured improved electrical contacts and properly waterproofed M6A1 rocket ammunition. But Sicily taught American commanders something unexpected. The bazooka wasn't just an anti-tank weapon, it was a universal problem solver for infantry combat. The terrain of Sicily presented unique challenges. Ancient stone towns with buildings dating back centuries, their walls 3 feet thick and seemingly impervious to rifle fire or grenades. Narrow streets perfect for ambushes. Hills covered with olive groves and stone terraces that provided natural cover for defenders. German and Italian forces had turned every structure into a miniature fortress. Traditional tactics for urban combat involved calling in artillery or tank support to blast through fortified positions. But artillery was often unavailable, and tanks struggled in narrow medieval streets where a single anti-tank gun could block an entire column. Infantry needed something portable that could break through stone walls and bunkers on demand. The bazooka proved perfect for the job. Sergeant David Kowalski of the 82nd Airborne Division discovered this by accident during fighting near Jella. His squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire coming from a stone farmhouse. The walls were too thick for grenades to penetrate, and attempting a direct assault across open ground would be suicide. Somebody said, "What about the bazooka?" Kowalski called in a 1944 interview. "We had one for taking out tanks, but no tanks were around. I thought, why not? Stone wall, tank armor, both need holes punched in them." He fired a single rocket into the farmhouse wall. The shaped charge, designed to penetrate steel armor, proved equally effective against ancient masonry. The rocket blew a hole 2 feet wide through the wall, showering defenders inside with stone fragments. The machine gun went silent. German soldiers stumbled out, hands raised, ears bleeding from the overpressure. Word spread quickly through American units. The bazooka could destroy fortified positions. Within days, infantry squads were using rockets to blast through walls, collapse bunker roofs, and create entry points into defended buildings. The weapon became standard equipment for urban combat, its anti-tank role almost secondary. The Germans noticed. An intelligence report captured from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, dated August 1943, warned, American infantry extensively equipped with rocket launchers, weapons employed not only against armor but against all fortified positions. Stone buildings provide inadequate protection.
Sicily also provided the bazooka's most famous early success against heavy armor. On July 17th, near the village of Biscari, a 2-man bazooka team from the 82nd Airborne encountered a Tiger I heavy tank, 56 tons of armor with frontal plating nearly impenetrable to most Allied anti-tank weapons. Private First Class Anthony Rodriguez and his loader, Private Thomas Blackwell, didn't have time for heavy support. The Tiger was advancing directly toward their position. Rodriguez made a split-second decision: aim for the driver's vision port, a narrow slit in the Tiger's glasses plate, reinforced with thick glass blocks, but fundamentally a weak point. Rodriguez fired from barely 80 yards. The rocket struck the vision port dead center. The shaped charge penetrated the glass blocks and thin armor behind, and the Tiger shuddered to a halt. The crew bailed out seconds later, leaving the massive tank immobilized. The 82nd Airborne's after-action report stated simply, "Bazooka team engaged and disabled Tiger I heavy tank through lucky shot to vision port." The word lucky appeared in the report, but the incident spread through American units like wildfire. If a bazooka could take down a Tiger, even through a lucky shot, then no German tank was truly invincible. By the end of the Sicily campaign, American units had destroyed 17 German tanks with bazookas. But the number didn't tell the full story. Dozens more German tanks had retreated or refused to advance when bazooka teams were spotted. The weapon's mere presence was changing German tactical behavior. Colonel James Gavin, commander of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, wrote in his combat diary, "The bazooka has restored confidence to American infantry facing armor. Men who would have retreated at the sight of a panzer now hold their ground, knowing they have a weapon that can fight back." German commanders frantically tried to adapt. Tank crews were ordered to add improvised armor. spare track links welded to turrets, sandbags piled on engine decks, logs chained to hull sides. Anything to provide standoff distance between the tank's actual armor and an incoming bazooka rocket. These modifications added weight and reduced speed, but they were necessary. The Italian campaign that followed took the bazooka's evolution even further. In December 1943, during brutal house-to-house fighting in Ortona, soldiers developed mouse-holing, using bazookas to blast through interior walls of buildings, allowing troops to advance from house to house without exposing themselves to German fire in the streets. By early 1944, the bazooka had transcended its original purpose. Yes, it could kill tanks, but it had become something more, a universal infantry support weapon. Need to clear a bunker? Bazooka. Break through a fortified wall? Bazooka. Suppress a machine gun nest? Bazooka.
June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and cold over the English Channel as the largest amphibious invasion in human history crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. Among the thousands of American soldiers struggling through the surf were men carrying the latest iteration of the weapon that had been cobbled together from scrapyard metal just 2 years earlier. The M9A1 bazooka represented significant evolution from the crude tube that had first seen combat. It was now a two-piece design, breaking down into sections easily carried by paratroopers or stowed in landing craft. The magneto-ignition system eliminated battery problems that had plagued soldiers in North Africa. An optical sight improved accuracy, though most combat still happened at distances where iron sights worked fine. But the real change wasn't in the weapon itself. It was in how thoroughly integrated the bazooka had become into American infantry doctrine. Every rifle company landing on Omaha and Utah beaches carried at least 18 bazookas distributed throughout its platoons. Every non-commissioned officer knew the weapon's capabilities. Every rifleman had trained on loading procedures. The bazooka was no longer experimental, it was standard infantry equipment, as familiar as the M1 Garand. The soldiers who carried these weapons into France had no idea they were about to face terrain seemingly designed to neutralize every American advantage. The hedgerows of Normandy, ancient earthen berms topped with centuries-old vegetation, created a maze of tiny fields, each one a natural fortress. These bocage hedgerows were thick enough to stop tanks, tall enough to prevent observation, and dense enough to conceal entire squads of defenders. For German forces fighting defensively, the hedgerows were paradise. Every field became a kill zone, every intersection a potential ambush. Tanks couldn't see threats until almost on top of them. Infantry advancing across open fields were cut down by machine gun fire from hedgerows they couldn't see through. For bazooka teams, the hedgerows became hunting grounds. The key was patience and positioning. German armor, constrained by narrow lanes between hedgerows, couldn't maneuver effectively. Panzer and Panther tanks that would have dominated open terrain were forced to advance single file down sunken roads, unable to deploy their main advantage, the ability to kill enemy armor at ranges exceeding a mile. American bazooka teams developed tactics specifically for hedgerow ambushes. 2 or 3 soldiers would position themselves in a hedgerow perpendicular to a road, waiting for German armor to pass. The first indication German tankers had of the threat was often the whoosh of a rocket motor, followed by the metallic clang of a shaped charge hitting their side armor, the weakest part of any tank. Private Leonard Jensen of the 29th Infantry Division described the technique. You let the first tank pass your position, if there's more than one, hit the second or third tank, blocking the road. Then the first tank can't reverse back, and the tanks behind can't advance. They're trapped in a lane maybe 10 feet wide with hedgerows on both sides and a burning tank in the middle. That's when artillery or other bazooka teams finish them off. The psychological impact on German tank crews was severe.
Crews who had operated with confidence in North Africa or the Russian steppes now dreaded every narrow lane and blind corner. Any hedgerow could conceal a bazooka team. The paranoia was justified. American after-action reports show that in the first 6 weeks after D-Day, bazookas accounted for 12% of all German tanks destroyed in the American sector. 12% might seem modest compared to tanks destroyed by other tanks or air power, but context matters. Bazooka kills were achieved by ordinary infantry using weapons carried on their shoulders at ranges where they could see enemy tank commanders' faces. Every tank destroyed by a bazooka was a tank killed by soldiers who were supposed to be helpless against armor. The German response evolved quickly. Tank commanders became increasingly reluctant to advance without extensive infantry reconnaissance. Panzer units that once operated as independent striking forces now refused to move until infantry had cleared the surrounding terrain. Wehrmacht tactical guidance issued in July 1944 explicitly warned, enemy infantry extensively equipped with rocket launchers. All armor advances must be accompanied by infantry support. Unsupported tank operations in close terrain not recommended. This was a remarkable admission. The German army, which had perfected combined arms operations and built doctrine around fast-moving armor, was now advising its tank commanders to move cautiously and wait for infantry. The bazooka hadn't just killed tanks, it had killed the boldness that made Blitzkrieg possible.
German countermeasures became more elaborate. Schürzen, thin armored skirts, were added to Panzer IVs and Panthers hanging several inches from the hull. Crews welded spare tracked links to turret sides, piled sandbags on engine decks, and attached logs or concrete blocks, anything to provide standoff protection. These modifications provided some defense but came at enormous cost. The additional weight slowed tanks, increased fuel consumption, and created maintenance nightmares. Worst of all, the modifications couldn't protect against ambushes from short range, where bazooka rockets were most accurate and most likely to find weak points. The tactical stalemate in Normandy, where Allied forces struggled to break out of the beachhead for weeks, wasn't due to the bazooka, but the weapon played a crucial role in preventing German counterattacks from pushing the Allies back into the sea. Every time German commanders attempted to amass armor for a decisive strike, bazooka-equipped American infantry made the advance costly and slow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.